In today's video, we're exploring a question that might seem simple on the surface, but carries profound implications for your happiness and well-being. Could living too close to your children in old age be quietly undermining your sense of fulfillment? It's a scenario that many of us dream about, being surrounded by loved ones, immersed in the daily rhythms of family life and finding renewed purpose in caring for the next generation. But what if, in your pursuit of connection and love, you're also surrendering something far more precious, your independence? What if the comfort of proximity is masking a deeper loss of autonomy, one that slowly erodes your sense of self and inner peace? Today, we'll uncover how rethinking this situation could transform your life, offering you not just more years, but richer, more meaningful ones. Before we dive deeper, I want you to focus on the story of Mrs. Rosa, a 70-year-old widow who, like many of us, believed that moving closer to her family was the best way to ensure a happy and fulfilling old age. She was right, at least at first. The joys of being close to her grandchildren, the laughter, the sense of purpose, they all seemed to confirm she had made the right choice. But as the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, something began to change. What felt like a dream slowly turned into a subtle yet profound loss of her own identity. Mrs. Rosa's story isn't just about her. It's a story about all of us. It's about the fine balance between loving those closest to us and not losing ourselves in the process. It's about living a life that is truly our own, in alignment with our deepest values and principles. And this is where the timeless wisdom of the Stoics comes into play. As we follow Mrs. Rosa on her journey, you'll discover how the Stoic philosophy can guide us toward reclaiming our independence, no matter our age. The Stoics taught us that true happiness comes not from external conditions, but from living in harmony with our inner nature. They remind us that it is not the length of life that matters, but how we use it. So as we continue, ask yourself, are you truly living your life, or are you living someone else's version of it? The Stoics believe that each moment offers us a choice, to either rise to our true potential or to shrink back into comfort. It's time to choose the former. Rise with the Stoics, reclaim your independence, and live the life you are meant to live. The power to transform your life lies within you. Seize it. Mrs. Rosa's initial joy. Let's step into Mrs. Rosa's world. At 70 years old, newly widowed and longing for connection, she made a decision that many would consider ideal, moving in with her daughter Lucia to be closer to her grandchildren. The idea of spending her days surrounded by family, filled with laughter and the sweet chaos of children, brought her immense joy. Who wouldn't want that in their later years? It felt like a dream come true. Mrs. Rosa threw herself into this new life with enthusiasm. Mornings were filled with the scent of pancakes and the giggles of little ones. She delighted in helping them with their homework, reliving her days as a teacher. Every moment seemed to be a blessing, as if she had found the fountain of youth in her grandchildren's smiles. This, she thought, is what life is supposed to be. And for a while, everything was perfect. The house was alive with intergenerational harmony, each day a blend of love, purpose, and fulfillment. Mrs. Rosa felt more vital than she had in years. She believed she had found the key to happiness in old age, being needed, being loved, and being useful. But as we know, even the brightest days can cast long shadows. What began as a joyful reunion with family gradually started to reveal the deeper complexities of this arrangement. Mrs. Rosa's days, once a blend of joyful activities and peaceful solitude, began to blur into a continuous stream of obligations. She started to wonder, was she truly living, or just existing in the service of others? This subtle shift, this creeping feeling of losing oneself, is something the Stoics understood well. They remind us that while love and connection are vital, so too is the ability to maintain our independence and live according to our own values. As we move forward, we'll see how Mrs. Rosa begins to feel the weight of her new life and the quiet erosion of her own identity. The question we must ask ourselves is, how do we balance our love for others with the need to stay true to ourselves? Stay tuned as we explore this delicate balance and how the wisdom of the Stoics can guide us through it. Mrs. Rosa's initial joy. Let's step into Mrs. Rosa's world. At 70 years old, newly widowed and longing for connection, she made a decision that many would consider ideal, moving in with her daughter Lucia to be closer to her grandchildren. The idea of spending her days surrounded by family, filled with laughter and the sweet chaos of children, brought her immense joy. Who wouldn't want that in their later years? It felt like a dream come true. Mrs. Rosa threw herself into this new life with enthusiasm. Mornings were filled with the scent of pancakes and the giggles of little ones. She delighted in helping them with their homework, reliving her days as a teacher. Every moment seemed to be a blessing, as if she had found the fountain of youth in her grandchildren's smiles. This, she thought, is what life is supposed to be. And for a while, everything was perfect. The house was alive with intergenerational harmony. Each day, a blend of love, purpose, and fulfillment. Mrs. Rosa felt more vital than she had in years. She believed she had found the key to happiness in old age, being needed, being loved, and being useful. But as we know, even the brightest days can cast long shadows. What began as a joyful reunion with family gradually started to reveal the deeper complexities of this arrangement. Mrs. Rosa's days, once a blend of joyful activities and peaceful solitude, began to blur into a continuous stream of obligations. She started to wonder, was she truly living or just existing in the service of others? This subtle shift, this creeping feeling of losing oneself, is something the Stoics understood well. They remind us that while love and connection are vital, so too is the ability to maintain our independence and live according to our own values. As we move forward, we'll see how Mrs. Rosa begins to feel the weight of her new life and the quiet erosion of her own identity. The question we must ask ourselves is, how do we balance our love for others with the need to stay true to ourselves? Stay tuned as we explore this delicate balance and how the wisdom of the Stoics can guide us through it. The shift in perspective. As the months passed, Mrs. Rosa began to feel a shift, something subtle but undeniable. The days, once filled with joyful tasks and cherished moments, started to blend into one another. What initially felt like a paradise of family togetherness slowly became a routine that left little room for her own desires. The joy of being surrounded by her grandchildren began to be accompanied by a sense of restlessness, a quiet yearning for something more. One afternoon, as she was preparing dinner, Mrs. Rosa overheard a conversation between her daughter Lucia and a friend. Lucia praised her mother, saying how indispensable she was, how the family couldn't manage without her. While the words were meant to be complimentary, Mrs. Rosa felt an unfamiliar pang of concern. Was she truly indispensable, or had she become indispensable at the cost of her own freedom? This unease grew over time. The philosopher Seneca once said, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it." Mrs. Rosa began to realize that her days were being consumed by the needs of others, leaving little time for herself. The quiet moments she once cherished, reading a book, enjoying a cup of tea in solitude, or simply reflecting on life, were now rare luxuries. The philosopher Epicurus also reminds us that pleasure is not found in constant busyness, but in living a life aligned with our true nature. Mrs. Rosa began to question whether she was living according to her own values or simply fulfilling the roles expected of her. She started to miss the autonomy she had once taken for granted, the freedom to decide how to spend her days, the ability to pursue her own passions without feeling guilty. As the routine solidified, Mrs. Rosa's thoughts increasingly drifted to her old apartment, where she had the freedom to come and go as she pleased, to engage in activities that brought her personal joy. She scolded herself for feeling this way, questioning how she could be so ungrateful when she had everything she thought she wanted. But the truth was becoming clear. While she loved her family deeply, she was beginning to lose sight of herself. This realization, as painful as it was, marked the beginning of an inner transformation, a shift in perspective that would eventually lead her to reclaim her independence. In the next part of her journey, Mrs. Rosa will face the difficult emotions that come with realizing she has lost touch with her own identity. We'll see how she navigates this complex situation and how the Stoic principles of self-discipline and self-reflection guide her toward a new understanding of what it means to truly live. The unseen burden. As the weeks turned into months, the excitement of Mrs. Rosa's new life with her family started to wane. The joy of helping with homework and preparing meals gradually became overshadowed by an unspoken sense of obligation. What had once been a labor of love now felt like a never-ending cycle of duties that left her drained. Mrs. Rosa found herself constantly busy, changing diapers, preparing bottles, chasing after her energetic grandchildren. The demands on her time and energy grew, yet she never complained. Like many grandmothers, she felt it was a duty to help her family. But with each passing day, she could feel something slipping away, her own sense of self. This growing burden, however subtle, is what some psychologists call the slave grandmother syndrome. Dr. Antonio Guaro coined this term to describe the emotional and physical toll that grandmothers can experience when they take on unpaid caregiving roles. It's a situation that many fall into without realizing the long-term impact on their mental and physical health. Imagine being on an emotional roller coaster. On one hand, you're filled with love for your grandchildren, cherishing every moment with them. On the other, you feel like your own life is slipping through your fingers as you juggle endless responsibilities. Mrs. Rosa was living this paradox daily, and it was beginning to take a toll. She noticed that the little things she used to enjoy were now distant memories. The freedom to decide how to spend her day, the simple pleasure of sleeping in or meeting a friend for coffee without rushing back, these were now luxuries she could hardly afford. The philosopher Epictetus once said, "Freedom is the only worthy goal in life. It is won by disregarding things that lie beyond our control." Yet, Mrs. Rosa's freedom felt increasingly out of reach, constrained by the expectations placed upon her. The lack of recognition for her efforts, the physical exhaustion, and the gradual erosion of her personal freedom began to weigh heavily on her. Despite her love for her family, Mrs. Rosa couldn't shake the feeling of loss that seemed to grow with each passing day. It was as if she were running an endless marathon, but instead of a finish line, there was only more to do, more to give. Research supports what Mrs. Rosa was experiencing. Studies show that grandmothers who take on full-time caregiving roles are at a higher risk of depression and anxiety. The constant demands and the loss of personal time can lead to a sense of burnout, leaving them feeling trapped in a role they never anticipated. And yet, Mrs. Rosa didn't complain. Like many in her position, she told herself that this was simply part of being a grandmother. But deep down, she began to wonder, is it really normal to sacrifice so much of oneself for the sake of others? Is it truly necessary to lose our own identity in the process of loving our family? As Mrs. Rosa wrestled with these questions, the tension between her duties and her desires became increasingly difficult to ignore. The Stoics teach us that while it's noble to care for others, we must also care for ourselves, preserving our autonomy and inner peace. In the next chapter of Mrs. Rosa's journey, we'll explore how these feelings of burden and loss bring her to a crucial turning point. It's a moment of truth, where she must decide whether to continue on the path of quiet sacrifice or to reclaim her independence and live according to her own values. The epiphany, a visit from a lifelong friend. One day, when the routine of family life seemed inescapable and Mrs. Rosa felt more trapped than ever, an unexpected visitor arrived, her lifelong friend, Carmela. Carmela had always been a beacon of light in Mrs. Rosa's life, known for her infectious laughter and wisdom that often came with a dose of humor. She hadn't seen Carmela in a while, and the surprise visit felt like a breath of fresh air. When Carmela walked through the door, she immediately noticed something different about her friend. "Rosa, what's going on? You look exhausted," Carmela said, her voice tinged with concern as she took in Rosa's tired expression and the disarray in the once immaculate house. Mrs. Rosa tried to brush it off with a smile, but as they sat down for coffee, the floodgates opened. With Carmela's gentle prodding, Mrs. Rosa began to share everything: the constant responsibilities, the overwhelming fatigue, and the creeping sense of losing herself. "I feel like I'm no longer Rosa. I'm just Grandma," she confessed, tears welling up as she spoke. She poured out her heart, explaining how she loved her family dearly, but somewhere along the way, she had lost sight of who she was. Carmela listened intently, nodding in understanding. When Mrs. Rosa finally finished, her friend squeezed her hand and said, "You know, Rosa, I went through the exact same thing, and I found a way out." Mrs. Rosa looked up, surprised. Carmela had always seemed so content, so free. Could it be that she had once felt this same weight? Carmela began to share her own story. After her husband had passed, her children convinced her to move in with them. For the first few months, it felt like a new chapter filled with love and support. But soon, she found herself overwhelmed by the same responsibilities that now burdened Mrs. Rosa. "I realized I was making the biggest mistake of my life," Carmela admitted. It was then that Carmela remembered the words of the philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson: "The only person you are destined to become is the person you decide to be." Inspired by this wisdom, Carmela made a bold decision to move into her own apartment. It wasn't easy. Her children didn't understand it at first, but over time, their relationship improved. Carmela's children began to see her not just as a caregiver, but as their mother, an independent and vibrant woman with her own life and passions. Mrs. Rosa listened, captivated by Carmela's story. The idea of reclaiming her independence, of living for herself once again, resonated deeply within her. Yet, doubts crept in. "But don't you feel alone sometimes?" Mrs. Rosa asked, her voice betraying her fears. Carmela smiled warmly. "Of course, sometimes. But as Carl Jung once said, loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you. And Rosa, since I regained my independence, my conversations with my children and grandchildren have become so much richer. When you're living your life fully, You have so much more to share with those you love." Carmela's words were like a key unlocking a door in Mrs. Rosa's mind. She realized that her desire for independence wasn't selfish. It was necessary. True happiness, as the Stoics teach us, comes from living in alignment with our own nature, from maintaining a balance between our duties to others and our duties to ourselves. With a newfound sense of purpose, Mrs. Rosa began to see a path forward. She didn't have to abandon her family. She simply needed to carve out space for herself within that life. As Carmela had said, it started with small steps. A solitary walk in the park, picking up a paintbrush again, even daring to dream about moving into her own place. This visit from Carmela planted a seed of change in Mrs. Rosa's heart. It was the beginning of a transformation she never imagined she needed. As she faced the challenge of reclaiming her independence, she began to understand that loving herself was not a betrayal of her family, but a necessary act of courage. In the next part of her journey, Mrs. Rosa will take her first brave steps toward regaining her autonomy, guided by the Stoic principle that true freedom comes from within. We'll see how these small acts of self-love lead to a profound shift in her life and in the lives of those around her. The journey toward independence. With Carmela's words echoing in her mind, Mrs. Rosa knew it was time to make a change. The realization that she could live her own life without sacrificing her love for her family had sparked something within her, a quiet resolve to reclaim her autonomy. But where to start? The idea of taking back her independence was both exhilarating and terrifying. Mrs. Rosa began with small, simple steps. One morning, she decided to take a solitary walk in the park. It was the first time in months that she had gone out alone without feeling guilty about not being at home to help. At first, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she should be doing something for her family. But as she walked, the fresh air and the gentle rustling of the trees around her began to soothe her restless mind. This hour of solitude became a daily ritual, a time for Mrs. Rosa to reconnect with herself. She found that these walks were not just physical exercise, but also a form of mental and emotional renewal. They offered her the space to reflect on her life, her forgotten dreams, and the woman she had once been before she became a full-time grandmother. Emboldened by this newfound peace, Mrs. Rosa decided to take another step, a bit bolder this time. She signed up for a painting workshop at the local community center, something she had always wanted to do but had put off for years. The first day she walked into the class, she was nervous. "What if I don't know how to paint anymore?" she thought to herself. But as the philosopher Pablo Picasso once said, "Inspiration exists, but it has to find you working." And so she picked up a paintbrush and began. To her delight, Mrs. Rosa quickly rediscovered her passion for art. Each stroke of the brush felt like a reclaiming of her identity, a small victory over the monotony that had consumed her days. In the workshop, she not only rediscovered her love of painting, but also made new friends, people who shared her interests and who, like her, were seeking to live fully and independently in their later years. The changes in Mrs. Rosa were subtle at first, but they grew more apparent as time passed. She felt more energized, more alive than she had in years. Her chronic aches and pains seemed to lessen, and her memory improved. These small acts of independence, walking alone, painting, socializing with new friends, were not just hobbies. They were life-affirming choices that renewed her sense of self. But with this newfound independence came unexpected challenges. There were days when guilt crept back in, whispering that she was being selfish, that she was neglecting her family. On those days, Mrs. Rosa remembered Carmela's wise words. "You can't pour from an empty cup." Taking care of herself was not an act of selfishness. It was essential for her well-being and for the well-being of her family. The Stoics teach us that true freedom lies in living in accordance with our nature, and Mrs. Rosa was beginning to understand what that meant for her. She realized that by nurturing her independence, she was not only preserving her own happiness, but also setting a powerful example for her family, showing them that life at any age should be lived with purpose and joy. As Mrs. Rosa continued to explore her independence, she found that the time she did spend with her family became more meaningful. She was no longer the tired, overwhelmed grandmother who was always around out of obligation. Instead, she became a source of inspiration, a woman who was living her life fully and intentionally. Her family began to see her not just as a caretaker, but as a vibrant individual with her own passions and dreams. In the next part of her journey, Mrs. Rosa will face the difficult but necessary conversation with her daughter Lucia. It's a pivotal moment where she must assert her need for independence, guided by the Stoic principle that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the determination to move forward in spite of it. We'll see how this conversation marks a turning point, not just for Mrs. Rosa, but for her entire family. The conversation with Lucia, the decision to regain her independence, had brought Mrs. Rosa a newfound sense of peace. But she knew that the hardest part was yet to come, telling her daughter, Lucia. The thought of this conversation filled her with anxiety. How would Lucia react? Would she understand, or would she feel abandoned, betrayed even? Mrs. Rosa knew that this discussion was necessary, but that didn't make it any easier. One evening, after the grandchildren were asleep, Mrs. Rosa found Lucia in the kitchen. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. "Lucia, we need to talk," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Lucia looked up concerned. "Of course, Mom. What's on your mind?" Mrs. Rosa paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "I've been thinking a lot lately," she began, "and I've realized that I need to make some changes in my life. I love you and the children more than anything, but I've come to understand that I need some space for myself, some independence." The words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. Lucia's eyes widened in surprise. "What do you mean, Mom? You're not happy here?" Mrs. Rosa smiled gently, trying to ease her daughter's concerns. "It's not that I'm unhappy. I've cherished every moment with you and the kids, but I'm starting to feel like I've lost touch with who I am, outside of being a mother and grandmother. I need to rediscover that part of myself." Lucia was silent, processing her mother's words. Mrs. Rosa continued, her voice gaining strength. "I want to move into my own place, somewhere close by, where I can have my own space and live on my own terms. I'm not disappearing and I'll still be here for you all, but I need this for me." The silence that followed was tense. Lucia's face was a mixture of emotions, surprise, confusion, a hint of sadness. "But Mom, aren't we enough? Don't you want to be with us?" Mrs. Rosa reached out, taking her daughter's hands in hers. "Lucia, you are more than enough. My love for you hasn't changed, and it never will. But I've realized that in order to be the best version of myself, I need to have some time and space that's just for me. I've spent so many years taking care of others that I've forgotten how to take care of myself." Lucia's eyes filled with tears, and Mrs. Rosa could see the struggle in her expression. "I guess I never thought about it that way," Lucia said softly. "I've just always seen you as this incredible mom and grandma who's always there. It's hard to imagine you living on your own." Mrs. Rosa nodded, understanding her daughter's feelings. I know it's a big change, and it might take some time to adjust. But I believe that by giving myself this space, I'll be a better mother and grandmother. I'll have more energy, more joy to share with all of you." Lucia wiped away a tear and finally managed a small smile. "I want you to be happy, Mum. If this is what you need, then I'll support you. We'll all support you." Mrs. Rosa felt a wave of relief wash over her. She hadn't been sure how Lucia would react, but hearing these words from her daughter meant everything. "Thank you, Lucia. I can't tell you how much that means to me." As they continued to talk, the tension eased and they began to discuss practical matters, finding the right apartment, how often they would visit, and what this new arrangement would look like. It was a conversation filled with both sadness and hope as they navigated this new chapter together. The Stoics teach that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. Mrs. Rosa had faced her fear, had the difficult conversation, and in doing so, she had taken a significant step toward reclaiming her life. This moment marked a turning point not just for Mrs. Rosa, but for her entire family. It set the stage for a new dynamic, one based on mutual respect, understanding, and the recognition that loving someone doesn't mean losing yourself. In the next part of Mrs. Rosa's journey, we'll see how this decision to move out and live independently transforms not only her life, but also the lives of those around her. It's a powerful reminder of the Stoic principle that our true strength lies within. And when we live in alignment with our values, we not only elevate ourselves, but inspire others to do the same. Embracing a new life. The day Mrs. Rosa moved into her new apartment was a mixture of emotions. As she crossed the threshold into her own space, she felt a surge of excitement tempered by a flicker of uncertainty. Was she doing the right thing? The small, cozy apartment was a blank canvas, waiting for her to fill it with her personality, her passions, and her dreams. It was the first time in years that she had a space that was entirely her own. As she began unpacking, Mrs. Rosa found that decorating her new home was unexpectedly therapeutic. Each item she placed, a vibrant rug, paintings of her favorite artists, family photos, was an affirmation of her identity. The colorful touches reflected her lively spirit, the one that had been dormant for too long. Even small decisions, like choosing to paint a wall a bold turquoise, felt empowering. She chuckled to herself, imagining what her late husband Ramon would say about her newfound boldness. But the real transformation began when Mrs. Rosa started stepping out of her comfort zone. Inspired by her friend Carmela, she signed up for a gardening workshop at the local community center. At first, she felt a bit out of place. Plants had never been her strong suit. But soon, she found herself enjoying the challenge. She met Mrs. Consuelo, another widow with a sharp sense of humor, and the two quickly became close friends. Together, they explored the idea of active aging, not just staying busy, but living with purpose and joy. The workshop turned into a weekly ritual, but that was only the beginning. Mrs. Rosa and Mrs. Consuelo decided to push their boundaries even further by signing up for yoga classes. The first session was a bit of a disaster. Mrs. Rosa joked that she felt like a pretzel stuck in the wrong shape. But they persisted. Soon, they noticed improvements in their flexibility, balance, and most importantly, their laughter. The joy they found in these activities was contagious, and it began to spill over into every aspect of Mrs. Rosa's life. One day, over coffee after class, Mrs. Consuelo remarked, "Have you noticed that we've stopped complaining about our aches and pains?" Mrs. Rosa realized it was true. They were so engaged in living that they had forgotten about their age. The philosopher Seneca once said, "Life is like a play. It's not the length, but the excellence of the acting that matters." Mrs. Rosa was determined to make her second act her best yet. As she grew more confident, Mrs. Rosa decided to join a book club where she rediscovered her love of poetry. The club was full of people from all walks of life, each bringing their own perspectives. For the first time in years, Mrs. Rosa started writing her own poetry again, something she hadn't done since her youth. She joked with her new friends that the wrinkles on the paper were less noticeable than those on her face. But the truth was, she felt as though she was rejuvenating her mind and spirit. But perhaps the most significant change was in her relationship with her family. Paradoxically, by having her own space, Mrs. Rosa found that her visits with her children and grandchildren became more meaningful. Without the constant pressure of caregiving, she was able to enjoy her time with them more fully. She was no longer the tired, overwhelmed grandmother. Instead, she was a vibrant woman with new stories to tell and experiences to share. One Sunday, while her eldest granddaughter helped her water the plants on her small balcony, Mrs. Rosa realized something fundamental. Not only had she regained her independence, but she was also teaching the younger generations an invaluable lesson, that life is meant to be lived fully at every stage. Her decision to embrace her autonomy had a ripple effect, showing her family that it's never too late to pursue one's passions and live with purpose. The Stoics teach us that true happiness comes from within, from living in harmony with our nature and values. Mrs. Rosa's journey was a testament to this wisdom. By reclaiming her independence, she not only improved her own life, but also enriched the lives of those around her. Her story reminds us that it's not the circumstances that define us, but how we respond to them. In the final part of her journey, Mrs. Rosa will reflect on the profound changes she has made and the lessons she has learned. We'll see how she continues to grow, not just as a grandmother, but as an individual who has embraced the fullness of life. Her story is a powerful example of the Stoic belief that the true measure of a life is not in its length, but in its depth and quality. Ripple effect inspiring her family. As the weeks turned into months, Mrs. Rosa's life flourished in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her newfound independence didn't just transform her own life, it created a ripple effect that spread throughout her family. The changes were subtle at first, but soon they became impossible to ignore. Lucia, who had initially struggled with her mother's decision to move out, began to notice the positive impact it had on their relationship. When they visited each other now, it was no longer out of a sense of duty or routine. Their time together became something to look forward to, a chance to reconnect, share stories, and enjoy each other's company without the stress of caregiving. Lucia saw her mother not just as a helper or a babysitter, but as a vibrant, independent woman with her own passions and interests. This shift in perspective inspired Lucia to reflect on her own life. She began to ask herself if she was living according to her own values or simply going through the motions. Watching her mother reclaim her independence gave Lucia the courage to pursue some of her own long-neglected dreams. She enrolled in a cooking class she'd always wanted to take, rekindled her love for painting, and even started carving out more time for herself amidst the demands of motherhood. For the grandchildren, Grandma Rosa became a source of fascination and inspiration. No longer just the ever-present caregiver, she was now a woman with a rich, fulfilling life outside of her role as a grandmother. The children were captivated by her stories about the art classes she attended, the new friends she made, and the poetry she wrote. They began to see her not just as someone who took care of them, but as someone who was still growing, learning, and enjoying life to the fullest. One afternoon, as they painted together on her balcony, little Matteo looked up at her and said, "Grandma, you're so cool. I want to be like you when I grow up." Mrs. Rosa smiled, her heart swelling with pride. She realized that by living her life fully, she was teaching her grandchildren an invaluable lesson, that it's important to always pursue your passions, no matter your age. The changes in Mrs. Rosa's life also began to have an impact on her son-in-law, who had initially been skeptical about her move. He noticed how much happier and more energetic she was, and how this positivity seemed to uplift the entire family. He started encouraging Lucia to follow her mother's example, to find her own space and time for herself, knowing that it would benefit not only her, but the whole family. This ripple effect extended beyond the immediate family. Mrs. Rosa's friends at the senior support group she attended were inspired by her story. She became somewhat of a guru to them, sharing her journey with humor and wisdom. "Old age," she would say, "is like a good wine. It needs room to breathe, but also the warmth of good company to develop all its flavor." Her words resonated with many who had felt trapped by their circumstances, encouraging them to seek out their own paths to independence and fulfillment. The Stoic principle of living in accordance with nature teaches us that we must embrace the challenges and changes in life with courage and grace. Mrs. Rosa's decision to reclaim her independence was a powerful example of this. She showed that true strength lies not in resisting change, but in embracing it, and that by living authentically, we inspire others to do the same. As Mrs. Rosa continued to grow into her new life, she found that her relationships with her family became deeper, more meaningful. The time they spent together was no longer overshadowed by unspoken obligations. Instead, it was filled with mutual respect, love, and a shared appreciation for the beauty of living life on one's own terms. In the final part of her story, Mrs. Rosa will reflect on the journey she's been through and the lessons she's learned along the way. We'll see how she continues to thrive, not just as a grandmother and mother, but as a woman who's embraced the fullness of life with open arms. Her story reminds us that it's never too late to pursue our own happiness, and that by doing so, we can inspire those around us to live more fully as well. Final reflection: the power of living fully. As time went on, Mrs. Rosa settled into her new life with a sense of peace and fulfillment she hadn't felt in years. Her days were now a blend of creativity, learning, and meaningful connections, not just with her family, but with herself. Every morning, she woke up with a renewed sense of purpose, eager to see what the day would bring. One quiet evening, after a particularly fulfilling day of painting and spending time with friends, Mrs. Rosa found herself reflecting on her journey. She sat on her balcony, a cup of tea warming her hands, and looked out at the city lights twinkling in the distance. The tranquility of the moment allowed her mind to drift back over the path she had traveled. She thought about the woman she had been when she first moved in with her daughter, the excitement, the joy of being needed, but also the gradual erosion of her own identity. She had entered that new chapter with love in her heart, but had slowly lost herself in the process. And then she remembered the shift, the moment she realized that living for others had its limits, and that to truly be there for her family, she first had to be there for herself. It was a difficult journey, one filled with self-doubt, fear, and tough decisions. But it was also a journey of self-discovery, courage, and ultimately, growth. Mrs. Rosa realized that in reclaiming her independence, she had not only enriched her own life, but had also given her family a precious gift. She had shown them, through her actions, that life's purpose isn't just about fulfilling roles, but about embracing the fullness of who we are as individuals. The Stoic wisdom that had guided her through this journey echoed in her thoughts. The words of Seneca, who taught that life is long enough if we know how to use it, resonated deeply with her. Mrs. Rosa knew that she was now using her time wisely, living not just for the sake of living, but with intention, passion, and joy. As she reflected, she also thought about the impact her journey had on her family. Her daughter Lucia, once hesitant and unsure, had grown into a more self-aware and fulfilled person, inspired by her mother's example. The grandchildren too had learned valuable lessons about the importance of pursuing one's passions and the strength that comes from being true to oneself. Mrs. Rosa's story was no longer just her own. It was a testament to the power of living fully, to the importance of finding balance between caring for others and caring for oneself. It was a reminder that true love doesn't mean sacrificing our happiness, it means sharing it, and that by living authentically, we not only enrich our own lives, but also inspire those around us to do the same. As she sat there gazing out into the night, Mrs. Rosa felt a deep sense of contentment. She had faced her fears, made difficult choices, and come out the other side stronger and more fulfilled. The journey wasn't always easy, but it was worth every step. Before she went inside for the night, Mrs. Rosa smiled to herself, thinking about the future. There were still many adventures to be had, many dreams to pursue, and many more memories to create. Life, she realized, was a gift, one that she would continue to unwrap day by day with gratitude and joy. So, dear viewers, I invite you to reflect on Mrs. Rosa's journey and ask yourself, are you living your life fully, or are you simply fulfilling the roles expected of you? Remember, it's never too late to reclaim your independence, to pursue your passions, and to live according to your values. Subscribe to Rise of Stoics to continue learning how the wisdom of the Stoics can guide you in living a life of purpose, courage, and fulfillment. Join our community of seekers, and let's rise together toward a life of true freedom and inner peace. The power to transform your life lies within you. Seize it